The hallways of Westwood High School were quiet in the late afternoon, the squeaking of a mop against the tiled floor the only sound breaking the silence. Diane Jackson moved methodically down the empty corridor, her shoulders slightly hunched after hours of cleaning. The building held a different kind of energy after the students and most of the staff had gone home, peaceful, yet somehow hollow without the usual chatter and footsteps. Diane saved the music room for last each day. It wasn't in her official cleaning route, but she had worked out a system where this particular room became her final stop before clocking out. There was something special about the way the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floor and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny performers. At the center of the room stood a magnificent grand piano, its glossy black surface reflecting the warm light. Diane often paused in her work just to admire it. In another life she might have, but no. Those were thoughts for another time. Excuse me. The sharp voice startled Diane from her thoughts. Mrs. Eleanor Wright stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, her thin lips pressed into a tight line. The music teacher's eyes traveled from Diane's worn uniform to the mop in her hands with barely concealed disdain. "I'm sorry," Diane said quietly, stepping back from the piano. "I was just about to clean in here." Mrs. Wright's heels clicked against the floor as she entered the room. "I would appreciate it if you wouldn't touch the piano. It's very valuable and the oils from hands can damage the finish." Diane nodded, though she hadn't been touching the instrument. "Of course. I understand." "I don't think you do," Mrs. Wright continued, adjusting some sheet music on the stand with meticulous care. "This is a Steinway concert grand. Do you have any idea what that means?" Something flickered in Diane's eyes, but her expression remained neutral. "It's expensive, I'm guessing." "It's not merely expensive," Mrs. Wright said with a hint of condescension. "It's an instrument of remarkable craftsmanship. The wood is specially selected, the strings hand-tuned. It's played by the finest musicians in the world." Diane nodded again and returned to her mopping, moving carefully around the room's perimeter. Mrs. Wright watched her with narrow eyes. "I've noticed you spend quite a bit of time in here. More than seems necessary for cleaning." "The acoustics are nice," Diane offered simply, "even when it's quiet." This seemed to amuse Mrs. Wright. "The acoustics? My, aren't we observant for a custodian?" Diane didn't respond, keeping her eyes on her work. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. "You know," Mrs. Wright continued, sitting down at her desk and organizing some papers, "I've been teaching music at Westwood for 23 years. I've helped dozens of students get accepted to prestigious conservatories. Juilliard, Berkeley, Oberlin." She glanced up to see if Diane was impressed, but the janitor's face revealed nothing. "I can tell within minutes whether a student has true potential or is simply wasting my time." "You must be very good at your job," Diane said, her tone sincere despite the conversation's uncomfortable direction. Mrs. Wright seemed taken aback by the compliment but quickly recovered. "Yes, well, it takes years of training to develop a proper ear for music. I started playing when I was 4 years old." "That's impressive," Diane replied, moving her mop beneath the chairs arranged in a semicircle for student practice. "It takes discipline," Mrs. Wright said, warming to her subject, something many people lack these days. Everyone wants immediate gratification. They don't understand that mastering an instrument requires sacrifice. While Mrs. Wright spoke, Diane finished mopping and began to dust the shelves lined with music books and trophies from competitions the school's orchestra had won over the years. Her movements were efficient but thorough, each item carefully lifted and replaced in exactly the same position. "You're very careful," Mrs. Wright observed. "I suppose I should thank you for that. The previous custodian was careless with my things." "Just doing my job," Diane said with a small smile. Mrs. Wright checked her watch. "I have a faculty meeting starting soon. They're using this room today because the conference room is being renovated." She looked at Diane pointedly. "Will you be finished soon?" "Yes, I just need to dust the piano and then I'll be out of your way." Mrs. Wright frowned. "Be very careful with the piano. Use a clean cloth, not whatever you've been using on those dusty shelves." "I always use a special cloth for the piano," Diane assured her, pulling a soft microfiber cloth from her supply cart. "No chemicals, just a light dusting." This seemed to surprise the music teacher. "Well, at least someone taught you proper care for instruments." Diane began to carefully dust the piano's surface, her movements gentle and reverent. As she worked, her eyes lingered on the keys, covered now by the fallboard. Her fingers twitched slightly at her side. Mrs. Wright noticed the gesture and raised an eyebrow. "Do you play?" she asked, her tone making it clear she found the idea unlikely. Diane hesitated. "A little," she said finally. "A long time ago, really?" Mrs. Wright's voice dripped with skepticism. "What kind of music?" "Just different things. Nothing special." Before Mrs. Wright could respond, the door opened and several teachers began to file in for the meeting. The principal, Dr. Rosario, entered with the school counselor, followed by the math department head and several others. They greeted Mrs. Wright and nodded politely to Diane, who tried to make herself as unobtrusive as possible while finishing her dusting. "Eleanor, thanks for letting us use your room," Dr. Rosario said. "The contractors say the conference room won't be ready until next week." "It's no problem," Mrs. Wright replied. "We were just discussing music. Our custodian here claims to play piano." Diane's shoulders tensed, but she continued working without looking up. "Is that so?" Dr. Rosario said with genuine interest. "That's wonderful." "Yes, isn't it?" Mrs. Wright said, her tone suggesting the opposite. The other teachers began arranging chairs in a circle for their meeting, though I imagine it's quite different from the classical training our students receive. Diane straightened up, having finished with the piano. "I should go," she said quietly. "I don't want to interrupt your meeting." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wright said, a strange glint in her eye. "Since you seem so interested in our Steinway, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your skills for my colleagues." Her lips curled into what might have been intended as a smile but looked more like a smirk. The room fell silent. Several teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I don't think that's necessary," Diane said, gathering her cleaning supplies. "Come now," Mrs. Wright insisted. "Surely someone who spends so much time around this instrument must have picked up something." "Don't be shy," Dr. Rosario frowned slightly. "Eleanor, I'm sure Ms. Jackson needs to finish her duties." "It will only take a moment," Mrs. Wright pressed. "I'm simply curious about her musical background. She mentioned playing different things. I'd love to hear an example." The mockery in her voice was unmistakable. Diane stood very still, her eyes fixed on the piano. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet, the tension palpable as the other faculty members watched the scene unfold with varying degrees of discomfort. "I really should finish my rounds," Diane said softly. "Just a quick demonstration," Mrs. Wright insisted. "One piece. Anything you know." She gestured to the piano bench as if offering a great honor, unless, of course, you were exaggerating your abilities. Diane looked around the room, noting the pity in some teachers' eyes and the embarrassed discomfort in others. For a brief moment, something like determination flashed across her face. She carefully set down her cleaning supplies and walked slowly toward the piano. "Well, this should be interesting," Mrs. Wright said to no one in particular, settling back in her chair with an expectant look that suggested she was preparing to be entertained, though not by any display of musical talent. As Diane approached the magnificent instrument, her posture changed almost imperceptibly. The slight hunch in her shoulders disappeared, her chin lifted, and something in her eyes shifted, a veil lifting to reveal a glimpse of someone else entirely, someone from another time and place. She sat down at the bench, adjusted its height with the familiarity of someone who had done so countless times before, and gently lifted the fallboard to reveal the pristine keys beneath. For a long moment, she simply looked at them, her hands hovering just above the ivory and ebony surface, as if remembering old friends. The teachers waited, some with second-hand embarrassment, others with curiosity, and Mrs. Wright with barely concealed smug anticipation. Diane took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and closed her eyes. The room held its breath as Diane's fingers hovered over the keys. Mrs. Wright's smirk remained fixed on her face, while several teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked away, unwilling to witness what they expected to be an uncomfortable moment of humiliation. Then Diane began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room, soft and delicate as raindrops. The melody flowed from her fingers with such grace that it seemed the piano was merely an extension of her body. The teachers froze, expressions of disbelief replacing their earlier discomfort. Mrs. Wright's smile vanished, her mouth falling open slightly as she stared at Diane's hands moving across the keys with practiced precision. The janitor's eyes remained closed, her body swaying gently with the music. Completely lost in the piece, the nocturne built gradually, Diane's left hand providing a steady pulse while her right hand embellished the haunting melody with flawless ornamentations. Her touch was impeccable, each note given exactly the right weight and color, the dynamics rising and falling like gentle waves. Dr. Rosario glanced at Mrs. Wright, whose face had drained of color. The music teacher's hands gripped the arms of her chair tightly, her knuckles white. As Diane approached the middle section of the piece, her playing grew more intense. The formerly hunched janitor now sat tall at the piano, her face transformed by the music. Gone was the quiet woman who cleaned their halls. In her place was an artist, commanding the magnificent instrument with authority and deep emotional understanding. The math teacher, Mr. Chen, closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair, clearly moved by the performance. The school counselor, Mrs. Patel, watched with tears forming in her eyes. When Diane reached the climax of the piece, her hands danced across the keyboard with both power and sensitivity. Then, as the main theme returned, she brought a new depth to the melody, as if telling a story of loss and remembrance through the notes. But what happened next left the room truly stunned. As she finished the final delicate notes of the Chopin, instead of stopping, Diane seamlessly transitioned into something entirely different. Her hands began to move in a new rhythm, and suddenly the classical piece had evolved into jazz. The sophisticated harmonies and syncopated rhythms of Thelonious Monk filled the room as she played Round Midnight with the skill of someone who had spent years studying the genre. Mrs. Wright's jaw clenched tighter as Diane's fingers created complex chords and improvised passages that spoke of both classical training and deep immersion in jazz traditions. The janitor opened her eyes now, watching her own hands as they created music that seemed impossible for someone Mrs. Wright had dismissed so completely. After a dazzling, improvised section, Diane shifted again, this time into a soulful gospel style that made the piano sing with emotion. Her body moved more freely now, her shoulders rolling with the rhythm as her fingers coaxed sounds from the Steinway that it might never have made before. In the formal music classroom, Dr. Rosario looked around at her staff. Not one person was checking their phone or looking at their notes for the meeting. Every eye was fixed on Diane, every face showing amazement. When the final notes faded into silence, nobody moved. The room remained perfectly still, as if afraid that any sound might break the spell that had been cast. Diane's hands rested in her lap, and she stared down at them for a long moment before looking up. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, the confidence that had radiated from her during the performance now dimming as she returned to her role as the school janitor. "I got carried away." "Sorry?" Dr. Rosario was the first to find her voice. "That was extraordinary." A round of applause broke out, startling Diane. Mr. Chen stood up, followed by several others, their faces bright with genuine appreciation. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Patel asked, wiping a tear from her cheek. Diane stood up from the piano bench, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "It was a long time ago." "That wasn't just playing," Mr. Chen said. "That was mastery. You're a concert pianist." Diane's eyes darted toward the door as if calculating her escape. "I used to be. Now I clean floors." Mrs. Wright had still not spoken. Her face had moved from shock to something more complex, disbelief mixed with embarrassment and a dawning realization of her mistake. "I should go," Diane said, moving to collect her cleaning supplies. "You all have a meeting." "Wait," Dr. Rosario said, stepping forward. "Please, I think we'd all like to know more." "There's not much to tell," Diane replied, though something in her voice suggested otherwise. "You don't go from playing like that to mopping floors without a story," said Mr. Chen. Diane sighed, looking around at the circle of curious faces. Only Mrs. Wright avoided her gaze, suddenly very interested in organizing the papers on her desk. "Life happens," Diane said simply. "Dreams don't always work out." "Were you professionally trained?" asked Mrs. Patel gently. A small, sad smile crossed Diane's face. "Yes, I was. Where?" The question came from Mrs. Wright, who had finally found her voice. It was softer than before, almost hesitant. Diane met her eyes. "Juilliard." The name hung in the air. Mrs. Wright blinked rapidly, her earlier boasting about sending students to the prestigious conservatory now taking on a painfully ironic quality. "I graduated 20 years ago," Diane continued, seeming to decide that the truth was simpler than evasion. "I toured for a while afterward. Europe, mainly. A few years in Asia. What happened?" asked Dr. Rosario. Diane picked up her dusting cloth and folded it carefully, her movements precise. "My mother got sick. Early onset Alzheimer's. She needed full-time care and we couldn't afford it. I came home to look after her." "But your career," Mrs. Patel began. "Taking a year off in classical music is like taking 10 years off in any other profession," Diane explained. "And it wasn't just a year. It was 5. By the time she passed away, nobody remembered who I was. My hands had stiffened from lack of proper practice. My connections had moved on," she shrugged. "So I did what I had to do. Found work where I could." "But with your talent," Mr. Chen started. "Talent doesn't pay bills," Diane said, not unkindly. "This job has steady hours and decent benefits. And it lets me be near a piano sometimes." Her eyes moved to the Steinway with unmistakable longing. Mrs. Wright stood up suddenly. "You should be teaching," she said, the words seeming to surprise even herself. "Not cleaning." Diane smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Who's going to hire a janitor to teach piano?" "I would," Dr. Rosario said immediately. The room went quiet again. Diane looked at the principal in disbelief. "We can't afford another full-time music teacher," Dr. Rosario admitted, "but we could certainly use someone of your caliber for advanced students, even part-time." "I don't have a teaching certificate," Diane pointed out. "There are ways around that for someone with your qualifications," Dr. Rosario assured her. "Artists in residence programs, specialist exemptions." Mrs. Wright's face had gone through a remarkable transformation in the past 15 minutes. The disdain was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. She cleared her throat. "Our advanced students would benefit tremendously from your expertise," she said formally, "particularly in jazz techniques. It's not my area of strength." The admission clearly cost her something. Diane regarded her thoughtfully. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I'm not sure it's a good idea. People get used to seeing you one way. It's hard to change that." "Perhaps," Dr. Rosario acknowledged, "but isn't it worth trying?" Diane didn't answer immediately. She looked again at the piano, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides as if they could feel the keys beneath them even from a distance. "I need to finish my rounds," she said finally. "The gym still needs cleaning before I clock out." "Of course," Dr. Rosario nodded. "But please think about it. My door's open whenever you want to talk." Diane nodded and gathered her cleaning cart. As she moved toward the door, Mrs. Wright stood up. "Miss Jackson," she called. Her voice lacking its earlier sharpness, Diane paused, turning to look at the music teacher. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Wright said stiffly. "I made assumptions that were incorrect." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The rest of the faculty watched the exchange with held breath. "We all make assumptions," Diane said finally. "It's what we do after we realize we're wrong that matters." With that, she pushed her cart out into the hallway, leaving behind a room full of teachers who suddenly found themselves reevaluating far more than just their meeting agenda. Mrs. Wright sank back into her chair, her face flushed with embarrassment. Dr. Rosario looked at her staff, all still processing what they had just witnessed. "I think," she said quietly, "we need to talk about talent and opportunity at Westwood High, and how we might be overlooking both in places we least expect." Outside in the empty hallway, Diane pushed her cart toward the gymnasium, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Her fingers continued to move at her sides, playing invisible notes in the air as a melody, her own this time, began to form in her mind for the first time in a very long time. Word traveled fast at Westwood High. By the next morning, the story of the janitor who played like a concert pianist had spread throughout the school. Students whispered in hallways between classes, teachers discussed it in the break room, and even the cafeteria staff had heard about Diane's stunning performance. Diane tried to go about her work as usual. She arrived early, before most of the staff and students, and focused on her cleaning tasks. But things had shifted. Teachers who had barely acknowledged her existence now smiled and greeted her by name. A few students who came in for morning activities watched her with curious eyes as she mopped the entrance hall. Around midday, while Diane was cleaning the windows in the main corridor, a hesitant voice called out to her. Ms. Jackson? She turned to find a girl of about 16 standing a few feet away, clutching a music folder to her chest. Diane recognized her as one of the students who often stayed late practicing in the music room. Yes, Diane replied, setting down her cleaning cloth. I'm Lisa, the girl said. I'm in Mrs. Wright's advanced piano class. She shifted nervously from one foot to the other. Is it true that you studied at Juilliard? Diane paused before answering. Yes, it's true, Lisa's eyes widened. And you performed in Europe? A long time ago. The girl took a step closer, lowering her voice. I've been working on Debussy's Clair de Lune for 3 months, and there's this one passage I just can't get right. Mrs. Wright says my interpretation is too... She searched for the word. Mechanical. Diane looked at the girl's earnest face and felt something stir within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. What part are you struggling with? She asked. Lisa opened her folder and pointed to a section in the middle of the piece. This transition, I can play the notes, but Mrs. Wright says it doesn't flow. Diane glanced at the music, instantly recognizing the delicate passage. It's about the phrasing, she said. You can't just play the notes as written. Debussy's music is like watching water move in a stream. It needs to breathe, Lisa nodded eagerly. That's what Mrs. Wright says, but I don't know how to make it breathe. Diane looked up and down the hallway. It was lunchtime and the corridor was empty. She dried her hands on her uniform. Show me how you're playing it now, she said. Lisa looked confused. But there's no piano here. Diane smiled. Pretend. She demonstrated, her fingers moving over an imaginary keyboard. You'd be surprised how much you can learn without actually touching the keys. Looking slightly embarrassed but determined, Lisa mimicked playing the passage in the air. Diane watched her hands carefully. I see the problem, she said when Lisa finished. You're breaking the phrase here and here. She pointed to spots in the music. Think of it as one continuous line, like you're painting with sound. She demonstrated with her own hands, showing how the wrists should move to connect the notes smoothly. Lisa tried to copy her movements. Better, Diane encouraged, but relax your wrists more. Let them float. They were so engrossed in their impromptu lesson that neither noticed Dr. Rosario approaching until she was standing right beside them. Good afternoon, the principal said with a smile. Lisa jumped slightly, quickly closing her music folder. I should get to lunch, she said, then turned to Diane. Thank you, Ms. Jackson. As the student hurried away, Dr. Rosario turned to Diane. That looked like teaching to me. Diane picked up her cleaning cloth again. Just some friendly advice. Dr. Rosario watched her for a moment. Have you thought any more about my offer? I have, Diane admitted, but I'm not sure it would work. Why not? Diane gestured to her uniform. Yesterday I was the invisible person who emptied their trash cans. Today I'm suddenly someone they're supposed to respect as a teacher? People don't adjust to that kind of change easily. Dr. Rosario considered this. People can surprise you, just like you surprised us yesterday. She paused. I spoke with the board this morning. They're intrigued by your background. Diane raised an eyebrow. Intrigued? Having a Juilliard graduate on staff, even part-time, would be quite a coup for our music program. They've authorized me to offer you a position as a special instructor. 3 afternoons a week. You could keep your current job if you want the security, but with reduced hours. Diane was silent for a long moment. I haven't taught before. Not formally. What you just did with Lisa looked pretty natural to me, Dr. Rosario pointed out. And you clearly have the expertise. And Mrs. Wright? It's her department. Dr. Rosario's expression turned more serious. I had a long conversation with Eleanor last night. What she did was inappropriate and disrespectful. She knows that. She was trying to embarrass me, Diane said quietly. Yes, Dr. Rosario acknowledged, and instead she embarrassed herself. It was a powerful lesson in checking assumptions and treating everyone with dignity. She sighed. Eleanor has been at Westwood for a long time. She's set in her ways, but she's not a bad person, she searched for the right word. Narrow-minded sometimes, but what happened yesterday shook her. In a good way. Diane looked unconvinced. She suggested the special instructor position herself, Dr. Rosario added. Said the advanced students could benefit from your clearly superior knowledge of jazz and modern techniques. This surprised Diane. She said that? Dr. Rosario nodded. It wasn't an easy admission for her. Diane turned back to the window, wiping slowly as she considered the offer. I haven't seriously played in years. My hands aren't what they used to be. You could have fooled everyone yesterday, Dr. Rosario said with a smile, including Mrs. Wright. A student walked by, giving Diane a curious glance. Word had definitely spread. Can I think about it? Diane asked finally. Of course, but don't think too long. Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden away with the cleaning supplies. After Dr. Rosario left, Diane continued her work, her mind churning with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. Teaching music, playing regularly again, using the education she'd worked so hard for. By the end of the school day, Diane had finished most of her usual cleaning rounds. As always, she saved the music room for last. She pushed her cart quietly down the hallway, hearing a piano being played as she approached. The door was partially open, and through the gap she could see Mrs. Wright sitting at the Steinway, helping a student with finger positions. Diane waited in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt. As she stood there, more students arrived for what appeared to be an after-school practice session. They filed into the room, some carrying instrument cases. Diane was about to turn away and come back later when Mrs. Wright looked up and saw her through the doorway. "Ms. Jackson," she called, her voice carrying into the hallway. "Please come in." Hesitantly, Diane entered the room, conscious of the students' curious stares. There were about a dozen teenagers, all members of what Diane guessed was the school's advanced music group. Mrs. Wright stood up from the piano bench. "Students, this is Ms. Jackson. Some of you may have heard about her. Demonstration yesterday." The students nodded, a few whispering to each other. "Ms. Jackson studied at Juilliard Conservatory and has performed internationally," Mrs. Wright continued, each word seeming to cost her some effort. "I've asked her to observe today's practice and perhaps offer some insights." Diane looked at Mrs. Wright in surprise. This wasn't part of any discussion they'd had. "I don't want to intrude on your class," she said. "It's not an intrusion," Mrs. Wright replied stiffly. "It's an invitation." The students watched this exchange with interest. Lisa, the girl from the hallway, gave Diane an encouraging smile. "We're working on a jazz arrangement," Mrs. Wright explained, indicating the sheet music on the piano. "It's not my area of expertise." The admission clearly pained her, but she continued, "However, based on your performance yesterday, it seems to be one of yours." Diane approached the piano cautiously and looked at the music. It was a student arrangement of Duke Ellington's Take the A Train adapted for their small ensemble. "We're having trouble with the swing rhythm," one of the students volunteered. "Mrs. Wright says we're playing it too straight." Diane glanced at Mrs. Wright, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "May I?" Diane asked, gesturing to the piano. Mrs. Wright stepped aside, allowing Diane to sit at the bench. The students gathered closer, their faces curious and expectant. "Jazz isn't just about the notes on the page," Diane began, placing her hands on the keys. "It's about what happens between the notes. The space, the timing." She played a simple phrase, first as written, then with a swing feel. "You have to loosen up. Let the music breathe." She demonstrated again, this time with more elaborate improvisation around the main theme. The students watched, transfixed as her fingers danced across the keys, bringing the music to life in a way their strict classical training hadn't prepared them for. When she finished, one of the students with a saxophone asked, "How do you know when to add those extra notes?" "They're not in the music. You listen," Diane said simply, "to the rhythm, to what the music is asking for. Jazz is a conversation, not a speech." For the next half hour, Diane worked with the students, showing them techniques for adding swing rhythm to their playing, explaining the basics of improvisation, and demonstrating how different instruments could complement each other in a jazz arrangement. Throughout the impromptu lesson, Mrs. Wright stood to the side watching silently. Her face was unreadable, but she made no move to interrupt or correct anything Diane said. When the session ended and the students began packing up their instruments, several thanked Diane, their earlier curiosity now replaced with genuine respect. As the room emptied, Diane and Mrs. Wright found themselves alone. An awkward silence hung between them. "Thank you," Mrs. Wright said finally. "They responded well to you." Diane nodded, unsure how to respond to this new, subdued version of the usually confident music teacher. "Dr. Rosario mentioned the teaching position to me," Diane said. "Yes." Mrs. Wright straightened some sheet music that didn't need straightening. It was my suggestion. Why? Diane asked directly. Mrs. Wright looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. Because talent should be recognized, even when it comes from unexpected places. She paused. Especially then. A week later, Diane stood in front of her small apartment mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse. It felt strange to be dressing in something other than her custodial uniform for work. The navy blue skirt and white blouse she'd chosen were simple but professional clothes from another life that had remained packed away in the back of her closet for years. Today would be her first official day as Westwood High's special music instructor. After much consideration and several more conversations with Dr. Rosario, she had accepted the position. She would continue her custodial work in the mornings but teach advanced piano students 3 afternoons a week. As she pinned her hair back neatly, Diane's stomach fluttered with nerves. It had been so long since she had thought of herself as a musician rather than a janitor. Would the students respect her? Would Mrs. Wright truly accept her in this new role? Could she actually teach? One day at a time, she told her reflection, repeating the phrase that had gotten her through many difficult periods in her life. When Diane arrived at school that morning, she performed her usual cleaning duties. A few teachers who passed her in the hallways did double takes at her changed appearance, but most just smiled and wished her good luck. Word about her new position had spread quickly. At noon, Diane stored her cleaning supplies and went to the faculty restroom to freshen up before her first class. As she washed her hands, the door opened and Mrs. Wright entered. Both women froze for a moment, then nodded in awkward greeting. First class today? Mrs. Wright asked, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, Diane replied, drying her hands. I'm a bit nervous, actually. Something that might have been sympathy flickered across Mrs. Wright's face. The students are excited. Especially Lisa Chen. She's been telling everyone how you helped her with the Debussy piece. She's talented, Diane said. Just needed a different perspective. Mrs. Wright nodded stiffly. I've put together some materials for you. Student profiles, their current repertoire, that sort of thing. They're on the desk in practice room B. That's where you'll be teaching. Thank you, Diane said, surprised by the thoughtful gesture. It's standard procedure for new instructors, Mrs. Wright said quickly, as if not wanting to appear too accommodating. Then after a pause, she added, Your first student is Thomas Walker. He's technically proficient but plays without feeling. Perhaps you can get through to him where I couldn't. With that, she turned and left, leaving Diane to ponder whether the comment was a criticism or an acknowledgement of Diane's different teaching approach. Practice room. B was smaller than the main music room, but well equipped with an upright piano, a small desk, and several chairs. As Mrs. Wright had promised, a folder sat on the desk containing information about each of the 6 students Diane would be teaching. That afternoon, Diane had just finished reviewing the first student's file when there was a knock at the door. A tall boy with glasses and an anxious expression stood in the doorway. Ms. Jackson, I'm Thomas Walker. I have a lesson at 12:30. Come in, Thomas, Diane said with a smile, gesturing to the piano. Let's hear what you've been working on. Thomas sat at the piano and placed his sheet music on the stand. It's Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, first movement, he said nervously. Mrs. Wright says I play it too mechanically. Let's see, Diane said, taking a seat where she could observe his hands. Thomas began to play. His technique was indeed flawless. Every note precisely as written, the tempo consistent, the dynamics observed. But Mrs. Wright had been right. There was something missing. The passion, the emotional depth that made Beethoven's music so powerful was absent. When he finished, Thomas looked at Diane expectantly. Your technique is excellent, she said truthfully. You've clearly practiced this piece extensively. But, Thomas prompted, obviously used to criticism. But music is more than just playing the right notes at the right time, Diane said gently, especially Beethoven. Do you know what was happening in his life when he wrote this sonata? Thomas shook his head. He was coming to terms with his hearing loss, Diane explained. Imagine being a musician, a composer, and realizing you're going deaf. The fear, the anger, the desperation, it's all in this music. She moved to sit beside Thomas on the bench. May I? He nodded and shifted to make room for her. Diane played the opening chords, letting the dramatic tension build before moving into the agitated allegro section. Feel how the music almost fights against itself, she said as she played. The contrast between light and dark, hope and despair. Beethoven wasn't just writing notes on a page. He was pouring out his soul. She stopped after the exposition section and turned to Thomas. Now you try. But this time, don't think about playing it perfectly. Think about telling Beethoven's story. Thomas hesitated, then began to play again. The difference was subtle at first, a slight emphasis here, a brief pause there. But gradually, as he continued, something changed in his approach. The notes became more than just notes. They began to speak. When he reached the development section, Diane noticed tears in his eyes. His body moved with the music now, his face expressing the emotions that his fingers were conveying. After he finished, there was a moment of silence. That, Diane said softly, was Beethoven. Thomas blinked rapidly, looking almost surprised by what had just happened. I felt it, he said, a note of wonder in his voice. I actually felt what he was trying to say. That's the secret, Diane told him. Technical perfection is important, but it's only the foundation. What you build on that foundation is what makes it art. For the rest of the lesson, they worked on specific passages, with Diane encouraging Thomas to think about the emotional intent behind each phrase. By the time their session ended, the transformation in his playing was remarkable. Thank you, Ms. Jackson, he said as he gathered his music. No one ever explained it to me like that before. As Thomas left, Diane noticed Mrs. Wright standing in the hallway outside. How long she had been there, Diane couldn't tell, but from the expression on her face, she had heard enough. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of lessons. Each student came with different strengths and challenges, but Diane found herself naturally adapting her approach to what each one needed. Lisa needed confidence, Shy Anthony needed encouragement to take risks with his interpretation, and brilliant but arrogant Rebecca needed to learn that technical prowess alone wasn't enough. By the end of the day, Diane was emotionally drained but exhilarated. Teaching, she discovered, required giving a piece of yourself to each student, drawing from your own experiences, your own struggles and triumphs to guide them on their journey. As she was gathering her things to leave, there was a knock at the practice room door. Dr. Rosario stood there with a smile. How was your first day as an instructor? Exhausting, Diane admitted, but wonderful. I heard from several students already, Dr. Rosario said. They're quite impressed. Even Thomas Walker's mother called to say he came home more excited about piano than she's seen in years. Diane felt a warmth spread through her chest. He just needed to connect with the music emotionally. Well, whatever you did, it worked. Dr. Rosario leaned against the doorframe. How does it feel, being back in the music world? Diane thought for a moment. Like coming home, she said finally. A home I thought I'd lost forever. You haven't just helped the students today, Dr. Rosario said. You've had an impact on others too, Mrs. Wright. Diane guessed. Dr. Rosario nodded. She observed parts of your lessons. She wouldn't admit it directly, but I think she's reevaluating some of her teaching methods. Diane wasn't sure how to respond to that. She's been the unquestioned authority on music at this school for over 2 decades, Dr. Rosario continued. It can't be easy for her to suddenly share that role, especially with someone she trailed off. Someone she looked down on, Diane finished frankly. Yes, Dr. Rosario acknowledged. But people can change. Sometimes they just need a wake-up call. As if on cue, Mrs. Wright appeared in the hallway. She hesitated when she saw them talking, then approached with determined steps. Dr. Rosario, Ms. Jackson. She nodded to each of them. I wanted to check how the first day went. Very well. I think, Diane replied cautiously. Thomas Walker's playing has improved dramatically in just 1 session, Mrs. Wright said, a note of reluctant admiration in her voice. Whatever you said to him about Beethoven's emotional state, it worked. Sometimes students need to understand the why behind the music, not just the how. Diane explained. Mrs. Wright pursed her lips, then said stiffly, I may have focused too much on technical precision in my teaching approach. Your methods appear to be effective. Coming from Mrs. Wright, this was high praise indeed. I was thinking, she continued, not quite meeting Diane's eyes, perhaps we could discuss a more collaborative approach for the advanced students. Your background in jazz and modern techniques complements my classical focus. Diane glanced at Dr. Rosario, who raised her eyebrows slightly in encouragement. I'd be open to that, Diane said carefully. Good, Mrs. Wright nodded briskly. We can discuss details later this week. I have some ideas for the spring recital that might incorporate both classical and jazz elements. With that, she turned and walked away. Her posture as rigid as ever, but something subtly changed in her demeanor. Dr. Rosario chuckled softly. Coming from Eleanor, that was practically a bear hug. Diane smiled. Small steps. That's usually how the most important journeys begin, Dr. Rosario replied. She checked her watch. I should go. But congratulations on a successful first day, Ms. Jackson. It seems you found your way back to where you belong. After Dr. Rosario left, Diane sat alone in the practice room for a few minutes. Her hands moved to the piano keys, playing a soft, thoughtful melody, something new, something that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. For the first time in years, she was creating music again, not just playing what others had written, but expressing her own thoughts, her own story. As the melody took shape under her fingers, Diane felt tears well up in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness or regret, but of recognition, of finding a part of herself that she had believed was gone forever. 3 months later, Westwood High's auditorium buzzed with excitement. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, programs in hand, waiting for the spring recital to begin. Behind the curtain, Diane adjusted Thomas Walker's bow tie and gave him a reassuring smile. Remember what we talked about, she said quietly. It's not about being perfect. It's about telling the story. Thomas nodded, his face a mixture of nerves and determination. I'll try, Miss Jackson. Nearby, Mrs. Wright was organizing the other students, checking their sheet music and giving last-minute instructions. The past 3 months had seen a gradual but significant shift in the relationship between the two music teachers. What had begun as reluctant cooperation had evolved into a working partnership, though not without occasional tension. Mrs. Wright still struggled with Diane's less structured approach to teaching, while Diane sometimes found Mrs. Wright's rigid methods frustrating. But they had found common ground in their shared love for music and dedication to their students. Tonight's recital was a testament to that partnership. For the first time in Westwood's history, the program included not just classical pieces but also jazz and contemporary compositions. Several pieces had been arranged by Diane herself, including a special finale that remained a surprise to most of the school community. 5 minutes? Everyone, Dr. Rosario announced, poking her head backstage. She gave Diane a thumbs up. Full house out there. The students huddled together, a mix of excitement and last-minute jitters. Lisa Chin, who would be performing Debussy's Clair de Lune, was practicing her hand movement silently. Rebecca Thompson, the technically brilliant but emotionally reserved senior, was reviewing her sheet music for Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a challenging piece that she had finally learned to play with genuine feeling under Diane's guidance. Mrs. Wright clapped her hands softly. Places, everyone. Remember, you've all worked very hard for this moment. Trust your preparation, Diane added, and enjoy yourselves up there. The audience can feel your connection to the music. The lights dimmed and Dr. Rosario walked onto the stage to welcome the audience and introduce the program. As she spoke about the school's expanded music curriculum and the collaboration between its two talented instructors, Diane felt a sudden wave of emotion. Just a few months ago, she had been invisible to most of these people, just the woman who cleaned their classrooms and emptied their trash. Now she stood backstage as a respected teacher, about to showcase her students' work and later, her own music. The recital began with the younger students performing simpler pieces, their faces concentrated and serious. As the evening progressed, the performances grew more advanced. Thomas Walker took the stage for his Beethoven sonata, and Diane held her breath as he began to play. His interpretation had grown so much in the past months, and tonight was no exception. The passion he brought to the piece drew the audience in, and when he finished, the applause was enthusiastic and genuine. One by one, the advanced students performed, each showing remarkable growth. Lisa's Debussy flowed like water, with the natural phrasing that had once eluded her. Rebecca's Chopin was technically brilliant, but also emotionally moving, bringing tears to several eyes in the audience. Then came the jazz section of the program. This was new territory for Westwood, and the audience seemed both curious and slightly surprised as the school's small jazz ensemble took the stage. They began with Duke Ellington's Take the A Train, the piece that Diane had helped them with on her first day of teaching. The students played with confidence and genuine swing, their enjoyment evident in their body language and the smiles they exchanged during particularly good improvised sections. Mrs. Wright stood next to Diane backstage, watching the performance with an unreadable expression. "They sound good," Diane said softly. Mrs. Wright nodded. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Jazz was never something I understood well enough to teach. But you recognized its value," Diane pointed out. "That's why you suggested I teach here." "Perhaps," Mrs. Wright said, a hint of her old stiffness returning. Then after a pause, she added more quietly, "Or perhaps I just recognized when someone had more to offer than I did." Before Diane could respond to this unexpected admission, the jazz ensemble finished their piece to enthusiastic applause. Dr. Rosario returned to the stage. "For our final performance tonight," she announced, "we have something special. As many of you know, Ms. Diane Jackson joined our faculty this year as a special music instructor. What you may not know is that before coming to Westwood, Ms. Jackson was a concert pianist who trained at Juilliard and performed throughout Europe and Asia." A murmur went through the audience. Some knew pieces of Diane's story, but many were hearing it for the first time. Tonight, Ms. Jackson will perform an original composition, accompanied by our advanced students. Please welcome to the stage Ms. Diane Jackson. The audience applauded as Diane walked onto the stage, suddenly feeling as nervous as she had before her very first concert decades ago. She took a seat at the grand piano that had been positioned center stage, adjusted the bench and looked up to see her students joining her. Thomas with a violin, Lisa at a smaller piano to the side, Rebecca with a cello, and the others with their respective instruments. Diane had titled her composition, New Beginnings. It incorporated elements of classical music, jazz and gospel, all the influences that had shaped her as a musician. She had written parts for each of her advanced students, tailoring the music to showcase their strengths while challenging them to grow. Taking a deep breath, Diane began to play. The piece opened with a simple, haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing. Gradually, other instruments joined in, adding layers of complexity and emotion. The music built slowly like a story unfolding, moving from moments of quiet introspection to powerful crescendos that filled the auditorium. As Diane played, she felt herself transported back to her days as a concert pianist, when music had been the center of her world. But this time was different. Now she wasn't playing alone, trying to prove herself on prestigious stages. She was creating something collaborative, sharing the spotlight with her students, watching them shine alongside her. The piece reached its climax with all instruments playing together in a joyful, triumphant passage that transformed the earlier melancholy theme into something hopeful and forward-looking. Then gradually the music softened again, ending with Diane alone at the piano playing a simple, peaceful coda that seemed to whisper of contentment and possibility. The final note hung in the air for a moment before the audience erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically as Diane and her students took their bows. From the side of the stage, she could see Dr. Rosario beaming with pride and, most surprising of all, Mrs. Wright wiping a tear from her eye. After the recital, the auditorium lobby filled with students and parents mingling and congratulating the performers. Diane found herself surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand and compliment her composition. Parents whose children she had never taught approached her to ask about lessons. A local reporter asked if she could interview Diane for a feature story about her journey from Juilliard to janitor to teacher. "You've started quite a revolution here," Dr. Rosario said, appearing at Diane's side with a glass of punch. "The board is talking about expanding the music program next year. More classes, more instruments, maybe even some music theory and composition courses." "That's wonderful," Diane said sincerely. "And they want you to lead the expansion," Dr. Rosario added. "Full-time position, proper teacher's salary and benefits. No more mopping floors unless you particularly enjoy it." Diane laughed softly. "I can't say I'll miss the cleaning part. So you'll accept?" Before Diane could answer, Mrs. Wright approached them. Her usual rigid posture seemed slightly relaxed this evening, perhaps due to the success of the recital. "That was an impressive composition," she said to Diane. "Your classical training was evident, but the modern elements gave it something unique." Coming from Mrs. Wright, "This was extraordinary praise, thank you," Diane replied. "I couldn't have done it without the students. Or without your willingness to try some